Well, hello. I'm going to continue my read through of Sven Beckert's Capitalism: A Global History, um, and and yeah, we'll see how this goes. Yeah, I got a little bit of a haircut. Uh, it's getting kind of hot here in Taiwan, but anyways, I'm going to talk. It's about 100 pages or so, chapters 4 and 5. Is that right? That can't be right. It's part 4. It's chapters 7 and 8, the rise of industrial capitalism and capturing the hinterland. So here we're kind of moving into the Industrial Revolution. And I've already read a little bit beyond this. The very next chapter after this is called The Capitalist Civilization. And I want to go back to something I talked about in the very first part of this series is I said, like, there's no class discussion here. And that was when I read the first 100 pages. I looked at the index and there wasn't much on class. He actually does let that term filter in. I think he's still pretty hesitant to use it a lot, but it does sort of filter in when we start talking about like the industrial capitalist class as it developed. And I think that's because it's kind of maybe it's emerging as a self-identified class. It's not just something coming from theory. But I'm going to keep my eyes out for that. If it comes up, I still think he's a little bit hesitant in using that term class throughout this work. But anyways, let's jump into chapter 7, the rise of industrial capitalism. This is always like the topic in history I'm kind of least interested in teaching, even though I'm like a labor historian by training. I don't know. I'm just not. Maybe I've done it so much. I actually think this approach, I'd rather teach the earlier chapters if I had to teach than this, because it's a little old fashioned. I think this book helps with that. I think going at this book this way certainly frees us from some of the more, I guess, some of the more traditional ways of teaching the Industrial Revolution. One thing he's very clear on is the Industrial Revolution is like an offshoot of capitalism. Capitalism could exist without industrialization. It could exist, with it, obviously. And I guess obviously industrialization can exist independent of capitalism, right? But here you kind of see them sort of linked together. Now, ultimately, he kind of starts in the traditional place. Maybe that's why this is kind of boring, because you kind of are stuck with talking about England and Scotland and these kind of places. Now, one thing he also talks about a lot in this chapter is how industrialization leads to the need for external markets because you're overproducing for the local market. So that's one theme throughout this chapter. Now, one thing he's constantly looking at throughout this whole book is constraints and countervailing forces. And both of those are a big part of this chapter as well. One of the constraints is labor, not technology. So there's a lot of focus when we teach this on the technology, like the spinning jenny and the Newcomen steam engine and these kinds of things. And that's all important, but that's sort of like, the technologies will just develop and they change. Once, it's not really problematic, I guess, that these technologies developed. They're tools to solve certain problems that emerged. Really where the bottleneck was, or the constraint on the explosion of capitalism, of industrial capitalism, was labor, not really the technology. And so you needed to be in an environment where there was a commodification of labor sort of already in the works. Now, we see commodification of labor in slavery most acutely. So it's not surprising, especially in chapter 8 on the hinterland, where it's really all about slavery. That's the heart of that chapter. Another question you can ask is, why isn't the proto-industrialization we studied in the last episode, back in chapter 5, why isn't that good enough? Well, capital investment in machines leads to the need for factories, right? Because once you have the tech, again, the development of the tech itself is not particularly problematic or interesting. But once the tech is developed, then yeah, you kind of have to have, people can't be Uber drivers. And like now, if you want to run Uber service, you just need a car, right? And an app. But if you want to like make a car factory, of course, you're going to need machines. So, or a whole fleet of taxis. You can't do that as one person, right? So capital investment leads to the need for factories, because once you have machines, you need to bring workers to the machines, not just bring the raw materials to the workers, like in the proto-industrialization model. And so this is going to necessitate the creation of kind of an industrial proletariat, right? Which is going to be stuck in one place, literally one place for most of the day, right? They can't move around, they can't manage their days, because if you're investing in a capital location, you're going to set shifts, you're going to set the working hours, you're going to set limitations on their mobility to make that investment worthwhile, right? And it can't be this kind of loosely formed semi-agrarian, semi-proto-industrial working class we saw previously. So what's going to create that industrial proletariat? Here we're using this Marxist language, I suppose, but I'm not sure if it's him or me, but yeah, I think he uses this language a little bit. And that is, obviously the old story is enclosure, all right? So enclosure, of course, commodifies land, but it also creates a commodification of labor, because now people are detached from the land and required to go out. Another theme here, of course, is new energy sources. And there's like all right, had some people come in to talk to me, so I kind of missed where I am. Energy sources. So I think there's been some like scholarship um, on like seeing the Industrial Revolution more as an energy revolution than the technical revolution. And I think that's probably true to that. But on the technology thing, I think the most interesting way to go at the technological changes, and he does bring this up here, is the tinkerer argument. The idea of kind of a bottom-up, like working class people tinkering with things, the tinkerer argument for the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's matched up if you look at the kind of people that innovated some of these technologies. So anyways, there's a lot going on here. For instance, one thing industrialization does, as Sven Beckert points out here, is complicate the supply chains. So you got producing for producers becoming a bigger part of the market. So it actually specialized manufacturing just for producers, just for other people. And that's like the building blocks of a complex supply chain we have today. And this is kind of creating new feedback loops too. The core example of this would be railroads, coal, and iron, right? So railroads become important for creating a broader market for goods and resources. And of course, railroads require coal. And then railroads themselves require an iron industry or steel industry, and that requires coal manufacturing too. So there's a feedback loop between these things. So as railroads expand, so does coal and steel industry. The spread itself, I think it's shockingly unproblematic in Sven Beckert's point. Like, there's whole books about the spread of the Industrial Revolution to France or Russia or these other places. I think Sven Beckert doesn't find that the spread of industrialization terribly problematic or interesting. You know, the technology spreads, so do state supports at various times. There's a lot about state supports here too, especially in this chapter. Tariff protections and things like that. But the formula for promoting industry is not something he's primarily that interested in. He's interested in capitalism, obviously. So that's beyond that. But it is here and it is discussed. Forced intensification of guild production. So this is another aspect of it. So the traditional argument you might give is the guilds sort of get washed away by industrialization, and he doesn't say so. That's not true. Guild production in the cities, because a lot of this manufacturing is taking place in the countryside, in rural areas where they build these factories. But in the cities, you still have a lot of urban manufacturing with the old guild structures. And that is itself a countervailing force from capitalism, but they're growing too, in part because of the supply chain needs, right? So a factory might require, just like today, a factory might require the needs of skilled machinists. But so the guilds are still there and growing. The problem is, or the difference is, they're reducing their overall importance in the overall economy. So factories are producing more at a faster rate than the guilds. It's the same way that like land profits for the landed aristocracy increased in the 19th century. I looked at the data from another book. The money, the income from land was going up for the rural aristocracy in places like England, but their share of national wealth was going down, right? So depending on your point of view, they're either becoming richer or poorer. They probably are squeezing their tenants more, squeezing their working class more, but they're also being left behind by the broader trends of the economy. The point, the consequence here is, of course, the Great Divergence. He does talk about the Great Divergence here specifically, which is obviously the gap in productivity between the West and the rest of the world, primarily like China. And the argument, I don't know if you know it, like if you've read it before, but in the 18th century, sorry, like England and Jiangnan, the area around Shanghai in China, pretty much equal in productivity and marketization and things like that. What changes is England takes off and China kind of stays in that 18th century kind of productivity level, right? Now, China itself is diverse, obviously. Most places in the world are diverse. Even England was diverse. But that few places, Scotland, the places in England where industrialization took root, were able to be so productive so quickly that they're able to promote this great divergence. And this is going to reorient global hierarchies away from kind of Asia and Indian Ocean and those kinds of places. So it's at this point in our story where we start to get at the question that's kind of at the heart of this chapter, which I think is very important to orient this chapter around, and that is wage labor. And the core question here is how to find wage labor. And you have to locate it. It's like any other commodity, right? It has to be there. And of course, someone's only going to be a wage laborer if they don't have other means of making a living, right? So who do you target? Who do you target who will be most likely to be attracted or at least accepting of wage labor? And the key is it's like going to be the most powerless. So we have different categories of people that Sven Beckert goes through to identify as these are the most powerless people who are most likely to be kind of coerced into the commodification of their labor. So this is kind of a slightly different view of proletarianization than we normally get. Like normally when you think of enclosure, you say, well, this kicks the peasants off, but the image in your mind might be a man, right? But men had more options than these other groups, with some exceptions. There's a couple ethnic groups that are identified here. But normally we might think of it like grown men push off the land, can no longer be peasants, and now they have to get a job in a factory or go to sea or go to America. Okay. Sven Beckert says, no, it's really the least powerful people even in that pre-modern kind of agrarian society that are going to get pushed into wage labor first. And these are going to be women, migrants, children, and then the Irish are particularly pointed out here too as a group. So yeah, a lot of these, like the migrants and Irish, we're talking about men in many cases, but it's not just low wages that are the reason women or children were targeted, or women and children were targeted. Like if you read other labor history, it might be, the idea of the family wage allowed wages for women to be suppressed. So they couldn't demand as much, lower rates of organization or politicization. Children, of course, could be easily replaced. They could get their hands into the machines. All that kind of stuff is relevant. It's important, but it's not the heart of it. The heart of it seems to be that they were the most powerless in society, and therefore the most likely to be sort of thrown into this into wage labor, which is presented here as something that most people would just want to resist, not want to be part of. And we do get to resistance in this chapter. Especially with the new social inequalities emerging as a result of wage labor, we get some resistance to that. It's not as prominent, I think, as in some of the other chapters. I'm getting the sense in this part of the book, we're really talking about the feedback loops capitalism has already gone far enough that it's kind of metastasized in a certain way. It doesn't mean there's not resistance, but that resistance, the countervailing forces aren't as strong as they used to be. If we think about the countervailing forces before, it's like religious traditions. It was things like established guild powers or a landed aristocracy, things that had a lot of established power, traditional power. And here like the Luddites I think they're mentioned in this chapter, they're hardly a countervailing force on par with like the landed aristocracy, where they have like rooted land, political power, traditions, reputation, spiritual and moral authority, and all those kinds of things. Capitalism has metastasized to a little point where a lot of those groups have been sort of seduced by it already and incorporated into it. And so resistance becomes a little, I don't want to say banal, but a little less capable of holding things back. Now, I think one thing he talks about throughout this chapter that's really, really important is this idea of a fixed capital being key to our this industrial process, which is, I think, in the big picture, if you can kind of guess where this book is going, you're thinking, well, now we don't have fixed capital, right? The neoliberal order is largely characterized by the commodification of like money itself to increasing degrees, the financialization of capitalism, right? And the fact that capital can move. And yeah, there's still factories where production takes place, but they're not necessarily as grounded. The capital's not as grounded. I don't know. You'd have to look. Maybe we'll have to see the numbers. Look at a fact company like GE or Ford or something like that. Which percentage of its capital and its profit goes back into production lines and hiring workers? Which percentage of the of any kind of businesses, you know, some might more than others, but I'm getting the sense that we're moving to an era where a bigger chunk of capital is just going into financialization, different financial products. And therefore, fixed capital is not really the driving force of capitalism anymore. It's there. We still need production, but it's not going to be, it's a smaller percentage. In the same way that land became a smaller percentage of the wealth. So anyways, I'm going to like take a break here and finish my thoughts. I'm kind of done with chapter 7. I'm going to look at chapter 8, capturing the hinterland. I'm just going to pause it and come back probably tomorrow to finish up my thoughts on this. I have finished reading this. I don't have as much to say about the chapter because it's a lot of examples, but this is about the kind of raw material side of things, because the factories in the cities, the machine-centered fixed capital in England and Scotland and places like that, it's going to require a vast periphery, a hinterland. So this is like a sequel to the chapter on the transforming the countryside, but we're moving like deeper and deeper into commodity production in the countryside. So I'm going to stop, and I'll be back in a second for you to talk about that. All right, so I'm back, and I was going to move on to whatever it is, chapter 8, but I wanted to talk a little bit more. I was going to go back to reviewing chapter 7 a little bit, the rise of industrial capitalism, and I wanted to go back to this issue of the state, because one thing that's in almost every chapter is the importance of the state, right? Um, and this is really key to the spread of industrial capitalism. And again, I like he doesn't really problematize the technology so much because it's a pretty easy thing to change. But the state's role here in promoting and encouraging and spreading industrial capitalism is really key to his approach here. Um, So, yeah, I'll just quote a little bit. This is from page 347. If access to technology and capital combined with a previous history of textile production was all that was needed to embark upon continent industrialization, the industry would have spread to much of the world. So that's my point before. Like, just there was plenty of capital, and the technology just spreads, right? Someone could put a sketch in their pocket and spread it, right? Because it did not. What sets places that experienced early continent industrialization apart from those that did not was an institutional framework, especially a powerful state that was interested in and able to constitute novel forms of capitalism, industrial capitalism. So industrial capitalism requires the state. So that's the key point here. Again, Britain showed the way. Not only was the United Kingdom in the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution, it was also in the vanguard of crafting a state that, unbeknownst to its protagonist, was usually well suited to launching its capital owners into a world changing trajectory. Britain's governing elites had constructed a state with great infrastructural, bureaucratic, fiscal, and military reach, an aggressive and intervening state, as one scholar argued. The very capacity that distinguished places that experienced early continent industrialization from those that did not. This powerful state had played a crucial role from the beginning, not least in protecting infant industries, as the British markets had been largely closed to textiles from continental Europe and India in the 17th and 18th century. States where industrialization began followed the British example and provided all kinds of incentives to engage in cotton manufacturing, including monopolies, privileges, and subsidies. So we could think of the United States, Hamilton's report on on industry. We can think of Egypt is another good example of that, although they kind of got undercut by the British, just like India eventually did. So the the key he's more interested in the institutional foundation of industrial capital than the technological one, and I think that's a good way to look at it. So, anyways, to wrap up here, let's talk about chapter 8. I don't know if I'll be as long on this chapter. It does cover about a century of history, 1780 to 1860, um, which, of course, is when slavery ends in the United States, so 1865. But he's looking globally. But I think there must be an important change. I guess we'll get to it later on. I do like this about this book that he's constantly focusing on the countryside. And capitalism is not just an urban or a factory phenomenon or just not something of trade, but something of like commodity production in the countryside. And this chapter, although it's quite long, it covers a lot of history. How long is it? So, yeah, like 70 pages or so to do this issue of capturing the hinterland. But yeah, I could kind of shift through it, but let me see what my notes are wrote down. I have to say on this. So, um, why did industrial capitalism need uh, the countryside kind of dominated, right? Captured, not just as the previous chapter was, not just transformed through certain commodity production in a small scale, but why did it have to be completely captured by capitalism, which eventually, by the end of the 19th century, I think it's fair to say was, at least in the United States, the Great West, uh, much of Europe, and then increasingly through imperialism, like Africa and Asia, right? Because of course, that's what imperialism was about largely too, right? So it was partially about markets, but also largely about capturing that hinterland for a steady supply of raw materials. So the question he asks is like, what does capitalism need from the countryside, right? This is actually kind of very Maoist in the way of like looking at the interplay between the center and the periphery in its in the analysis. But one thing it needed for commodity production, you needed land, right? So you just had to own land. You had to have access, like some kind of control for land, and the landed aristocracy may go along with this in certain cases, but often they're going to be this countervailing force. Um, so you need just physically to dominate the land, which probably just own it, right? You need property rights over that land. Um, More importantly, you need a predictable stream of inputs. So it's not just that we need stuff from the countryside. That's always been the case throughout human history. You needed it to be predictable, right? Because you had workers coming to the factory every day, so there had to be cotton there, and the cotton was coming from very far abroad. So you needed like it to be, you needed to have just in case. I don't think you use that language, but in a sense, just in case warehousing of various commodities, especially like cotton, for instance. But it had to be predictable, and this is where the American Civil War sort of became an issue in this. As you probably know, like the British had to find other supplies of cotton in other parts of the world, and they did, which is one of the reasons why the Confederacy failed to get any recognition abroad. That was their hope, right? That cotton would be so essential to the British economy that they'd be forced to recognize the Confederacy. They were, the British had already been preparing for these predictable streams of inputs. It wasn't just coming from the U.S. South. That was just one source. There were others. And then another thing, which maybe we don't always think about, is cheap food for low-wage workers, right? Of course, this, if you know the Corn Laws whole issue in Britain was about the tariff over food, imported food, because Britain started becoming a net food importer as fewer workers in the countryside or in industrial areas. And if you're going to keep wages suppressed, you need cheap food because that iron law of wages means you can't go below subsistence, since a big part of subsistence is food supplies. So you're going to need food imports and a cheap supply of food, either from your own hinterland, probably more likely in most cases from your own hinterland, or from abroad in certain cases. So how do we acquire all these goals, right? Not even to mention, I guess, labor. Like you still need the labor supply, but that's going to be increasingly dealt with through enslavement in many of these contexts. Wage labor, less important in the hinterland than more coercive forms of labor, secondary serfdom, second wave serfdom, whatever you want to call it. Um, and and what am I saying? Secondary serfdom and then enslavement, of course, right? Also, dispossession of land. The Americas had a very, very easy case of this because you had the eradication of the indigenous population. So you could seize that Western land. To do that, imperialism is going to do this. There's many, many forces that do this. The decline of the aristocracy, um, the pushing of workers into wage labor, all these kinds of things are going to play a role in the dispossession argument. Maybe the best example of this, or the easy example, is the United States. The United States comes up a lot, and particularly the New World, the Americas itself, comes up a lot in this chapter because this is where a lot of this is taking place. I think, as we'll see in later chapters with empire, it's going to spread to Africa and Asia increasingly. Um, so, anyways, dispossession of the land itself from the traditional holders. There's also going to be a need for the capital to be sort of unleashed to be active in the countryside. Um, Now, of course, we have that. Capital is flowing into the countryside. Again, this is something that the new studies of American enslavement, he's definitely drawing from a lot of that here, help us because we know how important it was that the planter class was a capitalist class and very, very financialized in many ways. And it had access to capital, right? Their land, their enslaved people that they claimed to own, all these kinds of things. And these states, these southern states, were very much invested in capital markets and investing in banking and things like that. State bonds are being issued. All these kinds of things are providing the capital we need for that. Um, so the next thing we're going to need, of course, is labor. And that's really, he just doesn't pull punches here, he just says it's enslavement, largely, at least in the United States case. But this could be replicated in other contexts with other forms of coercive labor. But across the Americas, you have slavery. Brazil doesn't end slavery, of course, until the 1880s or so. So having the legal infrastructure for that, having the political infrastructure for enslavement, all that kind of stuff is going to be key to that. And then the last part he highlights is political power. Where can I find that? Where he talks about that. He mentions it. But anyways, political power is going to be more for like stabilizing the markets, for maintaining legal, because like enslavement only works. Wage labor itself only works. Private property on land only works if you have state power to back those things up for the bourgeoisie. So with this kind of set up, and we use kind of the United States largely as a case study, we then can spread to other areas, to Java, to the Caribbean, to especially Cuba, British in India, Brazil, coffee plantations, Haiti up into the revolution and even after, all that. All of these different contexts are kind of going to have the same formula of like a coerced labor, introduction of capital, seizure of the land in some ways, and then more elaborate state forms that can like prop all this up. So, like I said, we just get a lot of examples of this, example after example. Yeah, one of the more fascinating might be the guano mining, which comes up at the end here. Maybe because I was just thinking about this, because I recently read American Lucifers, which is on light and the history of American light and illumination. And guano mining was one way that story really became a really global story and was kind of fascinating. But the labor here, the labor system established here is presented as really, really brutal with this indentured labor service, indentured labor, very unsafe conditions, long hours, you know, poor supply, all that kind of stuff. But super crucial to the global um, commodity chains that are being established. So we just get this picture of this massive expansion into the huge hinterland of the earth, which is, you know, like massive. All of these continents are being touched in various ways. Africa's not so much here, but it will be. It's the same point. And of course, Asia and Java, but the New World really is kind of the key, is key to this story, because the New World was where the hinterland was, where the indigenous population was eradicated by genocide, disease, things like that, conquest, and there were going to be just naturally fewer countervailing forces there. So the conquest of this, the capturing of the hinterland, created exactly what capitalism needed, which was a steady flow of raw materials. Agricultural export economies then become the result of this. Um, why do we still live in a world in which countries struggle to break free of like commodity production in rural areas? It's every country wants to industrialize, I suppose, to a certain degree. Every country wants to like lift themselves out of poverty, and they can't, right? And my students, younger students, will always just say, "Well, the solution is, like, why don't they just industrialize?" The problem is this global system that's demanding this thing and using various forms, state power, using coercive labor forms, even to this day, to ensure a steady supply of these raw materials. So, anyways, I think that does it for chapters 7 and 8. We're pretty close to the midway point of this book. Yeah, I think we're on page 450 or so, but we're not quite there yet. So I'm really excited to see where this book goes. I've started reading chapter 8, which is called A Capitalist Civilization, which is really where kind of a self-identified capitalist class sort of emerges. It's where we start to see the language of class actually enter into our conversation. Um, and then we're going to have a chapter 10, Rebellions, the Crisis of Old Regime Capitalism. So what I like about this is, just from the title, which makes me really excited to know what's going on here, is normally when we think of like the old regime, we think the old political regime, the aristocracy, overthrowing the aristocracy, the rebellions, and we think of like the Atlantic revolutions. We think, oh, we start in like the 1870s, 1770s and go on to the 1830s. No, this chapter is 1830 to 1870, and it's the crisis in old regime capitalism. So we're seeing rebellions. Obviously, I think the American Civil War, the end of enslavement, is going to be part of this. But what is going to be what is new regime? What, if everything we've studied up to this point is old regime capitalism, what's different about the later 19th century, and why are these rebellions leading to that, causing to that? So that's my question going into next chapter. Something I'm really excited to get into. But it's going to be a fun couple chapters here. Slightly different topics from the look of it, but um, wrapping up part 2 of the book in these 2 chapters before we get to, I guess, the progressive era, reconstructing capital and labor after that. So that's going to get us into the search for order, from this. But I also am interested in that too. It's like I often think of the progressive era, everything from scientific management to the labor movement, and those different progressive movements, as an attempt, at least in the United States, of dealing with the chaos caused by industrialization. But I'm wondering if really we should look at it as a response to the crisis caused by these rebellions that overthrew this old regime capitalism. Right? Because interrogating this concept of old regime capitalism is really what's got me most excited for the next few chapters. So, anyways, I'll do that. I'll be back shortly. So, anyways, thanks for joining me in reading this book. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions, or if there's anything important I missed. But until then, I'll see you.